All right, we are live. Hey, welcome y'all. My name is Matt Birkhold. Welcome to the fourth installment of Visionary Organizing Labs, Changing Ourselves to Change the World, Transformative Quarantine Conversation Series. Today, we are here with Nwamaka Agbo, who is, I'm grateful to have her here with us. I'm grateful she's taking the time to have this conversation with us. We met probably 8 months ago, I think. Visionary Organizing Lab was in Oakland to do a workshop, and the good brother Alan Frimpong hooked Nwamaka and myself up, and we had a phenomenal conversation. I think it was downtown Oakland. The good brother Calvin Williams came through after a minute, and we learned that we had these connections between us and all sorts of stuff. And so I will share, like I do with everybody, I was really struck by Nwamaka's ability, or what seemed like a real tendency to ask honest, hard, and pinpointed questions, and just kind of thoughtful nature. And we had an amazing conversation about a new economy movement and the need to understand personal transformation in addition to economic and political transformation. I need to heal and a need to be honest about what race has meant in relationship to capitalism and the economy, and what that all meant for for what we had to do with ourselves to move forward. And so we're all in for an enormous treat. So Nwamaka, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Of course, Matt. Thanks for having me. And it was, it was a really lively conversation. I appreciate people that are willing to kind of step into conversations where we can do some surfacing and digging just below the surface. So yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation. And it's just great to see you in the midst of everything that's happening in the world right now.
You too. Thank you. All right, we about to get it in. Word up. So Nwamaka, tell us a little bit about who you are and what's important to you, please.
Yeah, so that's a big question. Who I am, I live in deep East Oakland in the Bay Area with my partner, my husband Misha. I'm the daughter of immigrants, and so a lot of the way I look at the world is very much informed by the experience of my parents, particularly my mom's journey, coming to the United States, getting education, raising children, being married, traveling across the country, and all the ways in which race, culture, gender kind of has impacted her in her life. And I think through growing up and watching some of the challenges that my mom navigated with a lot of grace, but they were also really hard, is one of the reasons I'm in the work that I do. I'm always really trying to figure out what are the ways in which we support people in having agency and autonomy over their livelihoods, over their well-being. And so, my work has been informed through, years. I mean, I'm late 30s-ish now, but a long time participating in social movements, doing policy advocacy work, grassroots organizing, electoral organizing. And one of the first organizations I had a formal organizing job with was the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. I really think that Ella Josephine Baker is a leadership model that was visionary, but also grounded. She was one that really, I think she's one of the first examples of when we talk about like a leaderful movement, as we've seen in latest iterations of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think she exemplifies what a leaderful movement can look like when you're really working in solidarity with people on the ground to empower them and support them and really lift up their voices. All that to say, her work is also very much rooted in a solutions-oriented approach to the social problems impacting communities. And so my work and the way I was trained at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights was to really start to dig into how do we not only create an analysis around the structural problems disproportionately impacting low-income communities of color, but how do we create then a solutions-oriented approach? How do we also then create a solutions-oriented approach to how we we address those problems. And so that's kind of been the journey that I've been on, is one of which being very much in both the analysis, but then what are the solutions, and then what are the practical implications um, for developing those solutions. Like, what does it actually look like to be on the ground, being in the technical aspects of how we change these structural impacts?
Okay. Um, can I ask you, I'm going to thank you for that. And can I ask you to talk a little bit more about what a solutions oriented approach is?
Yeah, I think for me, the way I think of a solutions oriented approach, it's one in which it requires us to be in solidarity with finding what the problem is, figuring out the solution to the problem as much as naming what the problem is, right? And so some people will kind of say this as like, don't write a check that you can't cash, right?
Mm-hmm.
Don't bring up a problem that you haven't actually spent the time figuring out, well, what is a mechanism, a way to address it, a way to fix it. And not to say that there isn't just value in being able to understand what the problem is, but that the invitation for us is to all come together and then figure out, well, what are the steps to actually addressing this problem at the root, and what are the real challenges for some of the implementation strategies. I think one of the things I learned through working on policy work is that it's one thing to advocate for policy, in Sacramento. It's another thing to then be on the ground, taking that policy once it's passed and then figuring out, well, how do you then implement this? Who are the administrators that take the words and make sense of it in the day-to-day lives of people? And so those are that's how I like engage in solutions oriented work. I like to be both on like the big picture visionary thinking, but then like deeply in the weeds of like, okay, so what is actually necessary and critical to making this work? Because I also think that when we do that, then we understand that the solutions aren't necessarily not every approach is going to be the same for every problem, right? Each community has specific conditions, social, political, historical context that shape the approaches that are necessary. And so how do we understand the uniqueness of the solutions for a particular place and a particular people, rather than trying to kind of have a template of one size fits all? And so for me, that's what it means to be solutions oriented, to be able to be nuanced and discerning of what is necessary in a particular moment for a particular people in a particular place.
Thank you for that. So what I hear you saying, Nwamaka, is that for you, a solutions oriented approach means not only naming a problem, but then really thinking through not just what a potential solution might be, but also doing the work of thinking about how this potential solution might get implemented in ways that are specific to a place.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's exactly right. And the reason I think for me personally, this approach has been really helpful for me is that when I look back and study different social movements and study different revolutions, what has always been challenging is what happens after the victory. And so the opportunity to experiment with those small ways of like, what does it look for us when we actually do win? Michelle Mascarenhas Swan from Movement Generation oftentimes frames it as, if we are not prepared to govern, we are not prepared to win. And so the solutions oriented approach really challenges us to be in the rigor and be in the daily commitment of, well, how would we actually lead? How would we actually step into those governance roles for our community and do the work that needs to be done, rather than expecting that some other individual will know better for us than we do for ourselves? And so can we challenge ourselves to show up for our own communities the ways that we would want our elected officials to show up for our own communities? And it's through that then we actually understand what it means to engage with like some of the trickiest problems that we're all navigating at the intersections of public health, the criminal justice system, public education. Unfortunately, the list goes on and on. But the hashtags, the sound bites, are never as easy as what it actually takes to create transformative change on the ground.
No, that's right. I was really struck by your by your statement that you began to study what happens after the victory. Are you able to share how or why that became an important question to you?
Yeah, I think this was important to me in really watching two critical movements that kind of converged at the same time. The Occupy movement that kind of kicked off in New York in the United States, and then the Arab Spring movement, in
Mhm.
which we really watched particularly young people quite literally put their lives on the line to really demand that their governments and their economic systems change and transform and support those that are directly impacted on the ground. And what was hard for me, and I think hard for a lot of people, is that many of those movements were successful in their own ways, right? We saw many countries across the Eastern Hemisphere be successful in actually getting their leaders uh, out of their positions, but they didn't actually have enough resources, the capacity, the ability to then figure out who those other leaders may be that we were trying to put into place, what those new forms of government may be. And so the ability to be able to completely transform the systems, I think, is one that doesn't necessarily happen in one fell swoop, but it happens through iterations. And not to say that I think those movements were still successful, right? We still saw people come together and fight and win, and we still saw incremental shifts and changes in policy and in some constitutions. But in terms of what we were ultimately trying to transform, particularly in the collective consciousness, I
Mhm.
didn't necessarily see that shift the ways that I had wanted to, particularly even in the United States with Occupy Wall Street. And so, we started to see people move their money from Wall Street and try to figure out how to put their bank with credit unions and a bank with like black owned banks and businesses. But as a whole, that system continued to grow and persist, and that is one of the ways in which when I lift up like what does it mean for us to be prepared to win, and then to govern after that is like, well, what would we do when we actually win, and who would lead, and how would we lead, and how would it actually be different? Because the system continues to operate like it's like a pendulum. It swings. Our systems around white supremacy, like patriarchy, those are our habits, those are our patterns as a society. And so to intentionally shift them, we need individuals who can be in that system but then push back against that pendulum in the other direction. But you put anybody into that sea, if they're not actually clear about the system that they're operating within, they'll start to replicate the same things over and over again. And so I think that's why being able to hold ourselves with grace and nuance and understanding around like all that we're up against, and still committing ourselves to the rigor of what does it mean for us to be able to govern and care for ourselves, is also essential. Yeah, I feel like I'm rambling, but let me.
Ramble on. If that's rambling, your ramble's got it going on. But thank you for that. I mean, I'm absolutely fascinated um, that you drew those insights from Occupy and the Arab Spring, and I'm fascinated by it because what it demonstrates to me is the multiple paths by which people come to these questions. I think that because that's a question that has also been important to me, um, that hasn't been as important to as many people as I wish it was. And so I'm always fast. And so I came to it. I had old heads who, came out of various revolutionary movements and from various continents, and would talk about, they might have lived through or been close to people who lived through the anti-colonial struggles, in Asia and or Africa, and said, we've recreated this. And then I came out of, I had folks who trained me, who came out of Marxist organizations where, they would, what happened with the Russian Revolution and all of these other, how do these movements that claim to oppose, how do these movements become and begin to embody all that they had opposed at the beginning? And so to hear that you got that from observing, occupying the Arab Spring is phenomenal to me. I love it.
No, I appreciate you looking up some of those other historical movements, because I think that those are spot on, right? And I think, I'm here in Oakland, and for me, the Black Panthers and the Black Panther Party movement was such an inspiration. The focus in on self-determination, and I might reframe it for myself as collective determination, but the importance of understanding what it means for people to be able to directly provide and care for their neighbors. And we all, if we study that movement, we know that there were challenges around patriarchy, even within that movement and that institution. And all that to say, it's like none of this is perfect, but we are able to kind of take in some learnings from each of those movements to really figure out, well, what does that mean? What does that mean for us now? What does that mean for us today? And so, unfortunately, the history book is very long. We have a lot to draw from. Right in this moment, the question is, will we actually do that? And will we actually try to do something better in this next iteration? Like, what do we hope to improve upon in this particular moment? But yeah, all of that.
Thank you for that. And I want to follow up with one more question about that, because I think that, as I heard you talked about the emergence of uprising / occupations in New York and as it proliferated to the rest of the country in the Arab Spring. And you talked about people, I believe the quote was, shifting their money into Black banks or other institutions, but the system continued to grow. That to me that's a very particular observation that is pretty important and pretty rare, I think. Do you have any sense of how and or why, what allowed you to connect those dots and say, oh, this is about a system. This is not about a person who could have done something differently. This is about a system. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I'll try to answer it. And I imagine that you have some pieces to add to this as well, right? I don't think that it was any one particular thing for me. I think that for myself, I think, I had shared opening and talking about how I've worked on policy, I've done electoral organizing, grassroots organizing, helped to build organizations. And within all of those strategies, I came to understand that it's not any one of those strategies, but all of the things together that's actually necessary to create the transformation that we seek. In particular, I think that we have this way as movements where we want to find the one right way to do things, and it doesn't create spaciousness for a multitude of strategies, and it doesn't oftentimes create enough varied understanding to figure out, well, how do we stack our policy strategy with our grassroots strategy, with our electoral organizing, with our institution building, and and our inability sometimes to do all of that together. And instead we fall into conflict is where the breakdown happens. So all that to say, I think what I love is to see movements like, I think like Black Lives Matter is really starting to engage in this way, right? Came out with a very clear set of policy demands, and at the same time is supporting communities on the ground to work on specific projects. So we see both this grassroots approach, but then also this grass tops way of really trying to figure out, well, how do we bring those solutions together to help to start the transformation? I think for me, the other piece is what I really lean into is the importance of supporting right-sized movements in place. I serve on the board of this organization called Thousand Currents, and it's a public charities intermediary that is in solidarity with grassroots movements in the global South. And what's been really beautiful, what I've learned from a lot of those feminist-led movements, is the deep commitment to working on projects in a particular place with community while still having an analysis and changing systems. But it's those seedlings of shifts and experiments and projects in particular communities that we're actually trying to water and grow so that they actually can then get to a scale and a strength where they can then challenge a lot of the systems that we all analyze through our policies, through our protests in the streets. So I think for me, I'm always trying to figure out how do we create enough spaciousness and enough nuance for people to see themselves as a part of the change from wherever they're at, right? Some of the projects I work with, oftentimes we have organizations that are trying to figure out, well, what's our earned income strategy to sustain our organization? And so one of my questions is, well, who's going to be your project manager? Because I think organizers, people that are really good at connecting with community, they should continue to be organizers. And people that are really good entrepreneurs, particularly cooperative entrepreneurs that know how to run socially responsible businesses that provide good quality jobs and a relationship in the community, they should do that. And so rather than saying that one person has to be one or the other, how do we create space for both those people to see themselves, their roles and their gifts as part of the overall transformation that we need to have?
I love it.
I'd be talking a lot. I'm sorry.
I know. Keep talking. I mean, what you stirring up so much, and I think that on the one hand, right, I hear you saying when I hear you say that organizers ought to be organizers, and folks who are able to to manage projects ought to be able to do that, and they don't need to play the same role, but learn to be in relationship to each other and see the respective contributions that both roles make. Mm-hmm. I love that. And I think that it leads me to follow up on a distinction you made when you were talking about the Black Panther Party. Mm-hmm. And this was not a critique you made of them, but you said, when they use the language of self-determination, you might use the language of collective determination. Can you break down the distinction between those two and why you think collective determination is a more useful term than self-determination?
Fair enough. And I don't know if it's necessarily more useful. I think it's what resonates for me in this political moment, because, and I would say that even when the Black Panthers were using self-determination, it wasn't as the individual, but that's oftentimes when we say self, how we see it, because our economic system is one of which that glorifies the individual. So I lift up collective determination because, let me take a couple of step backs. I think one of the things I'm observing in this moment is we've created not only an economic system, but a cultural system that's supremely focused on the individual, right? The rights of the individual. And so when we see people go into government halls with guns saying that we need to reopen the government and you're infringing on my civil liberties as an individual, when the individual wants bump up against what is necessary and important for the collective, I think that's where a lot of the challenges happen. And we as a society haven't really figured out how to wrestle with that, because the way we think of democracy, our interpretation of democracy in the United States is one of one person, one vote, all about the individual. And in my study and read of democracy and deep democracy is one of which we really center the needs of the most impacted in making decisions that we know improve society as a whole. So one of the ways I think about this is through my work with restorative economics, when I talk about collaborative governance or governing for the whole, is when we think about the importance of ensuring that a young person in Oakland has shelter,
Mhm.
and we make it our priority to shelter this most vulnerable individual, chances are we're going to then provide shelter for their siblings, their brothers and sisters, their parents, their neighbors, their aunts and uncles. And so there's some pillars that are just essential to a good quality of life, that when we support those that are most vulnerable, the impacts are magnified through the rest of society and we're all better off. And I think oftentimes the individual needs bump up against this, because what people say is like, my right to a haircut does not necessarily challenges my ability, my family's, the barber's ability to really practice physical distancing and staying safe. And so for me, that's why I think it's helpful to start really lifting up the importance of the collective as opposed to just thinking about the individual, because the collective still implies that we have responsibility and we are accountable to others in our community. There's a way in which the individual, it's like, I just get to do what I want to do. It's like, actually, no. What we're not going to do, is have people out here taking steps and actions that are actually really dangerous for the collective and the well-being of all. We haven't really figured out how to make space and how to understand how to engage in a collective sense of well-being as a community. And I think that that's an interesting area of growth, not only for our social movements, but for society as a whole. And I think the last thing I'll say to this is I think this is where like some of our earlier conversations last year really come up, because what's interesting is to see where there are cultures that do have a sense of collective care and well-being, and knowing that collective care and well-being is rooted in they have responsibility as an individual to show up for that. And so me and my partner were chatting, and it was interesting and kind of talking about Japan was one of the countries that took more time to implement a physical shelter in place social distancing laws. But what he really lifted up for me, and sorry, I lift him up because he's Japanese, is that Japan has had a culture of using face masks, right? We see East Asian cultures in particular, even in crowded environments, still practicing a lot of the things that are conducive towards safety. And so like there's a culture already around how we show up as the individual in service of the collective that I think us in Western cultures still haven't, are still grappling to understand what that looks like and why it's important.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you. And thank you for your generosity of thought, and also thank you for your attention to language. I think that the way you just framed that Western cultures are still grappling with what it means to think about collectives rather than individuals. I mean, I think that there's what I hear in that statement of still grappling is very different than what I hear in the idea that the West is incapable of transcending individualism or something like that. And I think that I really want to just name and thank you for the generosity of spirit and hope embedded in your language.
Mm.
Because at a moment like this, the possibility that particular cultures are still developing, to frame it as particular cultures are still developing a means to grapple with the relationship between individualism and the collective versus condemning
Mhm.
a particular or specific cultures who are struggling with that is for me, it speaks to hope for a future that is really, really important. I want to ask you, because you mentioned, in Michigan, the state that I grew up in,
Mhm.
you know, last week, you get, you 3 weeks ago, you got a caravan, if you will, of protesters. Most, if not all of whom are white, who are making demands on, I want to get a haircut and so on and so forth. And then, the week later, you know, folks with similar, what sound like similar ideals storm the state building, with automatic weapons, with guns. We're living in a moment where, the climate crisis, it's clear that we cannot continue to burn fossil fuels and prioritize economic growth rooted in or that requires burning fossil fuels and continue to survive. We are here with COVID-19, and the lieutenant governor of Texas is saying there are things that are more important than life. He's saying, I will die so that my grandkids can experience growth in the American economy. And you get these people who were at this protest who are saying things like, I want a haircut. I want to go, I want to go back to work. And people saying, survival is more important than work. And this literally being a question. Is it more important to survive, or is it more important to generate economic growth? Literally being a question that we're faced with every day in very plain terms. Nwamaka, how do you make sense of this moment?
Yeah. So I think that there's a few things to unpack here. Maybe we can kind of come back to this conversation around our economic systems and capitalism specifically. But I think for me, there's three things that I've been trying to really sit with in this moment as we kind of look at this tug and pull around the economy and public health, is that there will always be people who are deeply invested in the system of capitalism. And I personally, I define capitalism, and, people try to, say there's conscious capitalism and all that thing. At the end of the day, capitalism is about profit maximization at any and all costs, right? Whether it's through extraction of fossil fuels, like you've lifted up, exploitation of labor, all of the things around history that unfortunately we can go back and look at. And so there are people that are deeply invested in that system, where they worship capital over care, over humanity, over well-being. And what's also interesting for me in this moment is, like, while we see people doubling down on that system because they're so deeply invested in it, there's people that have always been excluded from participating in any of the benefits of that system, right? When we look at policies like redlining, when we look at the history of enslavement, the genocide of indigenous people in this country, right? There are people that have always been excluded from partaking in any of the benefits of our economic system. And all that to say, those people have therefore been forced to make a way out of no way. And we've always had, while capitalism may be our dominant economic frame in the West, even on a global level, there have always been many economies, many informal economies that immigrant communities, low-income communities, LGBTQ communities have all used to support and survive in kind of the solidarity economy framework that we see as more visible in the global South, and is just starting to kind of really take root in social movements in the global North. And so those places where people are like, this is a system that doesn't actually see me as human being, that doesn't see me as worthy of care and consideration. Therefore, I'm going to go outside of that system and start to play with other mechanisms and ways of supporting my community. And so I think we're always going to kind of see this tug and war around those who want to kind of continue business as usual, and those that are actually trying to create a whole nother pathway outside of that. All that to say, I think one of the things I see this moment as being different from some of the other ways, from some of the other crises that we've experienced on a human scale, has been first, our ability to really understand the nature of this crisis is different, right? The level of information, the level of science and technology and information sharing is one in which people didn't actually have that during the Black Plague, right? People didn't during the Spanish flu have the ability to really understand how the virus was spreading, how it was impacting people, what the impacts were. And so I think for me, that's one thing that I think is significantly different. We have significantly more information. I also think there's this other piece around the level of connectivity and information sharing, right? The fact that you are in DC, I am, West Coast, who knows where other places in the world where people are listening on this Facebook live right now, the ability to connect and share information that doesn't only have to go through kind of the dominant media, I think is also something that we haven't had before. So we're able to kind of share information, share learning with each other in real time. I mean, going back to our previous conversation about the social movements of Occupy Wall Street and then Arab Spring, we saw the role that social media kind of played in being able to activate people in real time and share information so that people could show up. So I think that is unprecedented as well. So typically, powers that be will rely on suppressing information, suppressing connectivity so that people cannot share and organize. And we continue to find ways to be in relationship with each other across space and time, which I think is really, really beautiful. And then the last piece is the level of integration across societies and cultures is also is much more than it was before. And so people being introduced to new cultures and ways of being, people being just opened up to new frameworks and other possibilities of ways of living, ways of organizing life in society is one that is unparalleled in this moment to other previous points in history. And so I think all those things, right? The connectivity, the information sharing, the integration, all of these things come up to this moment to really see, well, given all of this, what will we as a society do with all that we now have, right? All that we're capable of. And for me, I think in some of my earlier meditations when shelter in place first went into inaction in California was I was just really sitting with like the learning from this moment. And the learning from this moment for me is that we are all interconnected. And on one hand, like, I know that sounds so basic. People are like, yeah, of course. But it is so simple. And at the same time, it is so profound, right? Like so profound to really understand and start to see the ways that a virus, something is ultimately invisible, is showing us how we move through place and space, how we engage, what it means to have consent to enter somebody else's like 6 foot distance. I mean, there was a moment when Me Too and Time's Up came out, and you could see people joking about, oh, I can't give you a hug now. It's like, actually, yeah, you might need to actually ask for consent, because it's as much about my safety as it is about yours, because you don't know if I have COVID or not. And so the way that this virus is really humbling us to like all the things that we kind of poo-pooed on and didn't take seriously, and are also seeing that like the level of interconnection across humanity is vast, and that we can't all collapse each other at the same time if we don't engage in that collective responsibility, or we can all sustain and support each other. And so yeah, I think for me, all those things are like, this is why this moment is unique and different. And the question is, will we as a collective be able to do more, make more, learn more, and evolve out of this moment in a new way? There will still be a dominant system that's very much invested in capitalism and white supremacy and patriarchy. And maybe hopefully there's more of us, more projects on the ground in place in particular communities that are trying to experiment and do something differently. I think the last thing I'll sit with that I've been really holding in this moment is I had the pleasure of observing a fishbowl conversation between two of my dear friends, Anasa Troutman out of Memphis and Jessica Norwood out of Mobile, Alabama. And Anasa raised a question to Jessica about, how do you envision yourself outside of white supremacy and male patriarchy? And these are two Black women. I guess I should maybe be clear about that. And I think all of us on that outside of that fishbowl who were also Black women having to sit with, what does it mean for us to be able to envision ourselves outside of a system, outside of a set of systems that were never meant for us, that were never meant to see us? And that, I think that is the ultimate question. We need to be able, as collectively, wrestle with what are we trying to create outside of those systems that are designed to harm and hurt, and spread violence. And that is the invitation. And can we do it? I think we can in small ways. Yeah, let me stop.
Well, I mean, thank you for that. You shared so much. And I want to pick up on this possibility to do things differently. You know, you shared that, you know, an early meditative moment was the degree of interconnection that exists between us, that this is brought home to you. And I think that the first Sunday, I think six or 7 weeks ago tomorrow, Sunday, in DC, largely women out of the Black Lives Matter network here in DC, began, and it was amazing because I think these 3 points you make around our level of interconnection, the information that exists between us, and then just the general integration that we experience. I mean, I think that morning, that Sunday morning on Facebook, I saw the emergence of a DC mutual aid network. And we live in Ward 5, DC, Northeast DC. And by that evening, mutual aid networks and WhatsApp lists had emerged for every ward within DC. And, over the course of 12 hours, I think that I got on that list the first day, and I think there were, 18 people when I got on the list. And there was something like 60, within just a couple of days. And as I see that happening in my kind of daily meditation, one of the things that really, really resonated with me was that everywhere in the world, the first thing I saw was that pollution had begun to clear up. I saw that without cruise ships, the water in the canals in Venice had become clear again for the first time in years. I'm seeing this mutual aid work emerge in DC and around the country. And I'm hearing from every, public health official, or anyone with any knowledge of public health, that the solution is to stay home. The solution is not in technological advancement. The solution is not even necessarily in medicine. The solution is to slow the hell down and stay at the crib.
Sit your ass down.
Yes. And for me, like, I think about when a people, and I mean that with a large people, I mean, the various identities that make up this country, no matter where we come from, we was, if we've lived in this country, if we were raised in this country, if we've been here long enough, we've been emerged in a culture that when faced with the question of survival or economic growth, we're more concerned of the cost of survival than we are with actually surviving. I think that I hope that when a people in that culture, with varying degrees of being of that culture, obviously, are forced to slow down, it is a moment in which the transformation of individuals can be enormous, I think. And my hope, I mean, it's clear if the pace at which the government is trying to reopen the economy means that we will be back quarantined in a matter of months over this same stretch that we're in. And I like to think and hope that each opportunity provides a chance for more people to get involved in mutual aid and begin to say, you know, we can do this ourselves. You know, we don't need. And I love what you were saying, Nwamaka, about in response to the question about how, when I asked you how you came to understand, I'm going to put this in quotes, the failure of movements. Well, I don't see it as a failure, but you said, you know, that history tells us that movements don't instantaneously just change everything, but they make contributions towards a longer process of change. I'm seeing and hoping that we're living through that exact same thing right now in this country, where as mutual aid grows and as more people oppose the quick reopening of the economy, there's an opportunity for us collectively to undergo a change in consciousness that says we can do this ourselves in a way that is a bit more dignity affirming than what I'm accustomed to experiencing in this country. But I also hear you saying, that in order for that to be meaningful and long lasting, we have to also undergo some personal healing. Can I ask, what that means to you? What does healing mean to you in this, you know, in this context, in whatever context?
Yeah, you said a lot of beautiful things. I'm just trying to sit with just some sense making. I think to kind of segue into this piece on the healing, I'll start with saying, you know, we've been using the word economy a lot, and you know, I've thrown out the word capitalism, and I think that until I went back to grad school, I understood economy to be a system that was very much about dollars and cents, right? When I think about economy, I think about supply and demand, elasticity, GDP. And I remember when one of the opening paragraphs in my textbook is that it said the study of the economy is to figure out who gets caviar and who eats potatoes, who drives a Corvette and who takes public transportation. And I lift this up to say that there's a worldview under which we understand economy. And there's a worldview under which we decide how to move kind of those dollars and cents. And one of the things that I'm super grateful to an organization, Movement Generation, lifting up, they have this, they've really helped to popularize the just transition framework. And they even have a zine on their website. I believe it's just movementgeneration.org. And one of the early opening pieces of that zine and in their trainings, they really break down the root meaning of the word economy. And economy, you know, if we look at the etymology of the word, it means the management of home. And so when I think about my home, I don't think about dollars and cents. I think about our culture, our tradition, our ways of being in community, our ways of feeding each other, our ways of like being in relationship to our neighborhoods, to our neighbors. And so I lift this up to say the lens through which we think about economy. I think this is when you talk about scientists telling us to stay home, it's an invitation to sit with what it means to be in our home within a dominant economy. It's an opportunity to really wrestle with what does it mean for us to actually go slow, to live long and well, as opposed to the productivity that we oftentimes are kicked into. And so, and I want to say that even those of us, you know, as you and I have talked about, those of us that are able to work from home is a privilege unto itself, given the essential work that's predominantly provided for by, you know, women of color. And so So all this to say, like that's like my intro into like this piece that you lifted up about healing.
Mhm.
So the opportunity to think about healing in that new definition of economy, and healing of one in which it allows us for repair. It allows us to set up new cultures, new traditions, new ways of exchanging, like you lifted up, doing mutual aid with our neighbors. Mutual aid is a practice that many social movements in the global south have down, right? We are just starting to really activate it and understand it in the global north. And so for me, I forgot to say in my intro, I'm a consultant after many years in social movements, and over the years have worked to develop a framework that, for lack of better words, I would say is kind of a moral code for me to think about how I provide project management support to social movements and community projects. But then more and more of my work is also helping to engage those financial institutions, wealth holders, donors that are also trying to figure out how to redistribute their wealth in mission aligned ways.
Mhm.
So my work on restorative economics is one that's very much rooted in reparations. My experience in being a part of some of the new economy movement, and that's a particular frame in the global north, is that it was those coming out of the 2008 recession, those that had access to the leisure time, the flexible capital, and the risk tolerance, that were then able to start being like, well, I'm gonna, do this new cool creative cooperative, or I'm gonna do this co-housing model through an Airbnb. And there's a way in which the new economy movement, I started to see some of the same patterns of sexism and racism replicated within this movement, where people are trying to talk about creating more equitable economic systems, but they were still bringing along some of the white supremacist tendencies from our extractive capitalist system. And so for me, I have found it helpful to really frame my work of restorative economics as one that first sits with reparations and restorative justice, and really acknowledging that we have an economic system that the reason we've been able to grow and proliferate in the West, and I think Nicole Hanna does a beautiful job talking about this in the 1619 series she did at the New York Times. We've Our wealth is all based off of genocide, off of enslavement, off of continuing to find ways to exclude people from being able to participate in a lot of the benefits of our economy. And so that in order for us to get to something that is actually more just and equitable, we first need to engage through a period of repair. Repair meaning we be intentional about who we are investing in, particularly low-income communities of color, how we are investing in them using non-extractive finance. So essentially ensuring that we're leaving more wealth in the community that we actually extract. So when you have a credit card and they're trying to charge you 20% interest, like that's extractive. They're actually making more money off of you than you're ever spending using their credit card. And then what we are investing in, how do we actually invest in the projects that start to actually get towards a sense of shared prosperity, community well-being that's very much rooted in ensuring that we all get to benefit and not just the individual. And so that's why for me, it's helpful to think about being very intentional about who we're moving money to, and how we do it as a form of healing. Because when we invest in those low-income communities that have been extracted from and excluded, and we help to kind of make them whole, we invest in their capacity, ensure that they have the resources to enact agency, then they actually have what they need to be able to participate in a conversation about how we create a more equitable economy. But until their needs are met, until they are able to actually pay their bills, pay their rent, be able to have access to safe and healthy food, they don't have the emotional, mental capacity to then have a conversation about, well, how do we really rethink this, the way we do tariffs and trades, and it's just not actually equitable. And I think this is where the Black Panther Party really understood. This is why they had the breakfast food program. Young kids needed to be able to eat. You actually need to have a full belly. Your brain needs to be able to function to even then be able to have the presence of mind to engage in a conversation around self-determination. And so all this to say, I think that there's an opportunity for us to engage in healing in a way that invests in those that have not had access to the resources that they need, and to do it in a way where we're building them up. So for me, restorative economics looks at supporting community-owned and stewarded projects. I think of those projects as being equitable economic development projects, so quite literally uh, buildings that people are jointly owning together. I think that looks like community governed loan funds. If we were to look at some of the examples like Boston Ujima coming out of the East Coast, we also have Seed Commons and National Cooperative Community Loan Fund. There's a number of different ways people are starting to come together to create community-owned infrastructure to help with the redistribution of wealth back in to their communities, and that they're figuring out then as we have those assets together, coming back to this piece on governance, how do we collectively govern those assets together? How are we coming together to wrestle with the decisions, not of who eats caviar and who eats potatoes, but how do we make sure that we're all well fed, right? And that's actually, those are really hard conversations to have, but they're necessary. And once again, it's through the doing and wrestling with the challenges and nuances of those conversations that we actually understand how we create transformation. And that at the end of the day, for me, my work is not just to ensure that more people own more things together, which I think at a baseline that's like beautiful and would be great, but understanding that it's the economic power that we're collectively building as a community that then allows us to then leverage that and engage in the political power, right? Then we actually are able to come to a conversation not only as a community member, but also as I am also a community business owner in this cooperative. I am also a community landlord in our cooperative real estate housing project. And you have a different footing by which to then make political arguments, to move policy, to organize. And all of that is then once again embedded in our culture. Right. And so our cultural, our economic, and our political power are all things that kind of integrate together. And it's through, once again, the process of moving resources to those communities that most need it that we engage in this place of healing. And you and I had started to have this conversation before we started the live, and I hope that you can kind of talk about the caring economy work that you're doing locally. But this is where we also start to see how the individual transformation gets stacked within the interpersonal, the institutional, the cultural transformation as well, right? It's actively like me being in a project, like one of the projects that I have the pleasure of supporting is a project called Black Land and Power. It's an initiative of the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. And we're really coming to wrestle with the question of what is the role of land for Black liberation, and how do we create mechanisms to collectively steward and govern that land in a non-extractive way. And it's through being in that project and understanding what is our governance over this land, how will we raise the capital to acquire land or maintain it, how will we do the organizing on all those things have allowed me to not just be in the theory and the vision of the work, but also the technical realities of what it takes to do that work on the ground. And I think that is where the individual transformation comes up in relationship to, once again, the organizational and the institutional.
Yeah.
And then the last piece I'll say, since you kind of brought up mutual aid, I think for me, one of the things that comes up is people oftentimes ask me, so one of the many hats I wear is kind of engaging with philanthropy. And people have been asking me, what is our rapid response strategies for COVID-19? And mutual aid has been one of the things that continue to come up. And I've really been encouraging people to think about mutual aid and some of the other collective well-being strategies, not just as something to do in this rapid response moment, but these are actually the fabric, the thread of what we need in the long term, right? People coming together to aggregate capital to move it to people to pay their rent, people coming together and helping to distribute groceries and food. All those things are actually what we need in a solidarity economy going forward. Once we kind of, the government quote unquote reopens, my hope is that those things don't stop. But if anything, those ways of connectivity, those strategies for supporting local neighbors become more formalized and more rigorous. And I think that is what's also exciting. And so for us to not think about like, oh, well, that was just what we did when we were sheltering in place. It's like, oh, that's actually an insight to the type of society that I want to be a part of and I want to create going forward. But all that to say, I want to hear more about your work. What is this? Yeah, so tell me about this carrying economy, the carrying
Yeah.
systems work that you're setting up.
Well, I will share that there's an organization in Kingston, New York. And Kingston, New York is 23,000 people. It's about 60 miles north of New York City. And 10 years ago, 9 years ago, there was a gentleman who wanted to see a particular band in Kingston. And he was a dentist. And he got a hold of their booking agent and said, do you think the band might be willing to come up here and play in exchange for dental care for the whole band? And these musicians said, shit, I ain't seen a dentist in 10 years. Yeah, let's go. And it wasn't just, a teeth clinic. It was like, whatever dental care is necessary, I'll provide. And from that one exchange emerged something called the O Positive Festival. O positive, the blood type. I believe I don't, my knowledge of blood type is not good. I have none of it actually, but I don't think there is an O positive blood. I think there's O negative, but they flipped it to call it O positive. And so over 9 years, they've done 10 festivals in Kingston. They've done a few in Poughkeepsie, New York. They did 1 or 2 in Chicago, and I think they did 1 or 2 somewhere else. And over these 9 years, I don't have these numbers lodged in my brain, but if I remember correctly, they've been able to organize over 400 care providers to provide care for artists, musicians, performance artists. Something like 4,000 people without insurance have received care in exchange for whatever art they do. And it's not a one-to-one exchange. Like O Positive conceptualizes both care and art as community goods. And that these are things a community needs: art, a community needs music, a community needs performance, and so on and so forth. And a community needs care. It needs medical doctors. It needs dentists. It needs Reiki practitioners. It needs massage therapists and acupuncturists and care broadly conceived. And so after doing this for 9 or 10 years, for 9 years, 10 festivals, they said, we think we've reached our capacity. We do this once a year. People need care around the year, and people who are not artists need care. How do we move forward? And in this question of how they move forward, they hooked up with a gentleman by the name of Martin Kirk, who I'll be in conversation with next week here at the same time. And Martin had, working with Martin, they had come to a realization that what they wanted to do was create a localized care system from the ground up. And so they called Visionary Organizing Lab and representing VOL. I began to work with these folks, and I tell you, I am so impressed. And I will tell you that one of the things that impresses me most is it's a group of 18 people who have committed to meeting every other week for 12 weeks and with no expectations. The idea was, and most of these people have been involved with O Positive, the care providers who have been volunteer care providers at some point over the last 9 years. And Nwamaka, we came together and I said, you all have assumed an awesome responsibility that no one has ever assumed before. And we don't know what will work. We don't know, but we know what doesn't work. And so we're going to chart a course to try to make new mistakes as we create a care system that everybody can access. And so over the course of that, we developed a shared understanding of the healthcare industry in relationship to patriarchal racial capitalism, and how it is that, as you pointed out so eloquently, wealth doesn't exist alongside the genocide of Native Americans and the raping and pillage and burning of women across continents and the enslavement of Africans and continued racism and colonialism after the formal ending of enslavement. But it exists because of that. It exists, in direct relationship to it, not alongside it. But without those material forms of oppression, wealth doesn't exist. And so we ask ourselves, or we ask the group, how a care system would it have been possible for care to be anything other than it is today, rooted in this system and the cultural system, the relational, cultural, and economic system. And with that, I need to back up and say that in talking with every one of these care providers in this room and asking, what drew you to care work and why do you continue to do it? Because these are folks who, they have hit me to a rash of doctor suicides, because the care profession, the medical professions, doctors want to spend more than 15 minutes with a patient. Doctors want to provide a kind of care that the system in which they work doesn't allow them to provide. And so in my question of what keeps you doing it, what I understand is that there's a room full of 18 people who feel called to care for others. And I say that because what I've learned over the years, and I've learned in new ways over the last 12 weeks, is that when you get a room full of people who are trying to embody their calling, amazing things emerge. And so these folks have developed a vision for what a localized care system might look like. And I won't quote it, but I can talk about how ill it is. And I won't quote it because I simply don't have it handy. But they want to create a care system in which access to it is not contingent upon money. It is something in which it is something that is culturally relevant and culturally responsive to specific peoples. In their vision for a new care system, the unity of mind, body, and spirit is a guiding principle as a way to reclaim the way in which patriarchal racial capitalism has severed us from our mind and spirit and body. And embedded in their vision is the idea that being of service to others is healing. And so these folks, and we'll do this over the next few months, they've identified a handful of small experiments that we'll see if a new care system can emerge from. And part of these are listening centers. They might be neighborhood houses or community houses that have care professionals located in them and located in a series of neighborhood care pods. We've talked about providing self-care practices for care professionals. And we've talked about care providers owned cooperative, in which, for example, there are several, direct primary care has emerged as an alternative to insurance. And this is largely physicians who, want to provide a more humane form of care than they're able to under the insurance system. And so as a way to bypass the insurance system, they've made themselves available for $60 a month membership fees. And, for $60 a month, a physician will come make a house call. However, you got to pay out of pocket and full price for any lab work and pharmaceuticals and prescriptions and all that. And so collectively, the group said, we said, what might it look like to engage in a cooperative form of ownership around this $60 a month membership fee? So I did the math and I said, if we want to generate $1 million a month, $1 million a year, how many memberships do we need? And it was something like 1,337. And it seemed that was a number that might be manageable. And with that $1 million a year, you could bulk purchase meds and provide them at an affordable rate, and you could house a family practitioner, a dentist, a therapist, an acupuncturist, a chiropractor, a Reiki practitioner, whatever. And for $60 a month, you could literally see any of those when you want to. And they've gone so far as to imagine a Kingston care department that is not connected to the city, but is intentionally named as though it should be, to arrange a kind of time banking practice where if you can't afford $60 a month, you have access to a time bank where you can bank hours that then allow you to receive the same medical care that people who pay $60 a month pay. And so I'm blessed, honored, and humbled to have had the opportunity to engage with these folks, and who see in this current public health crisis an opportunity for the work that they want to do become a reality. And I think that to get back what you were saying, Nwamaka, about hope and the consistent practice of mutual aid, I think that for people who have the courage and boldness to imagine alternatives, in a way that 6 months ago seemed absurd, today things are so broken and so visibly broken to the average everyday person that which seemed unimaginable 6 months ago now seems necessary. And so I have been blown away by these people's commitment to care and their commitment to their callings, which has allowed them to assume the audacious responsibility of developing a vision for a new care system and then beginning to experiment with practices that might make reality more closely resemble that vision.
I'm just so happy you're recording this, and I'm really moved by that work and that vision. I've not heard of this example, and I think it's such a beautiful articulation and experimentation. I think in what I was trying to allude to earlier, right? That there's ways that people are on the ground are already trying new ways of being, and so yeah, I'm so curious to learn more. I'm so love hearing about the combination of a cooperative structure with a care system. You're also kind of looking at using procurement practices to kind of make things more accessible. And once again, right, this is where all of our learnings over years of participating in various movements kind of adds up to then being able to bring that forth. And I would love if you would share a little bit more about, if you would be so bold, what about your own personal transformation what have you been learning about yourself in this moment, in this 18-week commitment? Yeah, or 12-week commitment to 18 people. Yeah.
Here you go asking the hard questions. That's all right. I've been asking them I've been asking the hard questions for 4 weeks in a row now, so I suppose it's my turn. Thank you for that. I think that, you know, and you and I spoke to this. We were talking about this before we went live. Um, you know, over the years, um, let me just say this. I think the second week that quarantine measures and shelter in place and shelter in home measures had been taken, I woke up one morning with a deep sense of grief that I hadn't yet named. You know, I just felt like trash. I was like, ugh, you know, it just didn't feel good. And I remember looking out the window, this window right here to my right, um, and saying, man, there are two fronts on which it's very visible that as a species, we face a choice between survival or capitalism. Um, you know, and those two fronts being the climate crisis, and this public health crisis, and this very real confrontation around the fact that at this moment, economic growth requires human beings commit suicide. Um, and that hit me in a way that was very sad. You know, very sad because it, you know, Nwamaka, I've prided myself on believing in the capacity for human transformation and social transformation my entire adult life. And I've also learned over the years, you know, I've been fortunate to be trained by a number of amazing old heads. You know, Tony Montero in Philadelphia, Muhammad Ahmed in Philadelphia, Grace Lee Boggs in Detroit. You know, these are people who I worked with very closely and who were very generous with me, which meant that I cultivated a particular set of skills that are specific to me, that allow me to be of use in ways that are specific to me. Um, and my personal history of personal transformation and being a guy who you know who left high school and you know was involved in nickel and dime street activity as a young person and who grew into a person who didn't have a plan of living beyond 20 years old, and then to grow into a human being who earnestly tries to contribute more than I take from others on a daily basis. Um, Over years, I came to understand that that combination of experiences said, you know, there are some things that are specific to you that allow you to be of service in ways that are specific to you. Um, at the same time, being scared to death of both claiming that and then cultivating it and embodying it, because it, you know, I feel a level of vulnerability when I step out on that and own it and name it and say, you know, I have this to offer. And so when I say, and so, you know, the work of Visionary Organizing Lab is literally about um, making plain that in very material terms, we face survival or capitalism, and that we live in a culture where rather than just choose survival, we're more concerned with how much surviving is going to cost. And locating those two poles and saying we have to transform ourselves. We have to culturally transform ourselves into people who believe our lives are worth saving, and each other's lives are worth saving, and that we need a new social, political, and economic system or civilization to make that possible. And so when I saw, when I accepted, man, we face this choice on two fronts. um, the work became far more practical than it had been, 6 weeks or 6 months prior. You know, what was abstract had all of a sudden become concrete. And so, I said, Matt, you got to get over this fear. You got to get over this fear, and you got to get out your own way. Because if you don't learn to work through this fear of claiming your gifts and sharing them, and playing right sized, not playing big, not playing small, but playing right sized, practicing humility, and so I said, okay, I gotta figure out how to play right sized. And so I called a therapist, and within 60 minutes had been given a perspective. As a young person, I developed a tendency to not own and or betray my potential as a way to survive, as a survival skill. I simply didn't go to schools. I didn't grow up around people who had the skills to encourage me to cultivate that which I was good at. And so, at 40 years old, I had to do some grieving and some reconnecting to the way that the world had not completely successfully, though had done a hell of a job in beating those gifts out of me. And so since, the work of the previous 12 weeks has brought home to me the quarantine associated with this pandemic as an opportunity to get out of my own way and to learn how to amazingly let my brain rest and learn to be more guided by my heart than I am by my brain, which I found, I shared that when we began the work in Kingston, we said, we don't know where we're going. That's a huge cultural commitment to ask of people whom have access to text messages to get certainty at any moment of the day within seconds, to be able to say, let's take this collective journey to the unknown and see what emerges. And then to embed that in developing a shared understanding of the historical development of patriarchal racial capitalism, and the crisis point that it's in, and then be able to pose the question if a new care system today can be as significant to a new large scale system as the enslavement of Africans was, to the system that has organized our lives for the last 400 to 600 years and is in permanent crisis at this point. And so what I've learned in my own journey of transformation has been one in which I've been reminded and been forced to develop new practices, to be curious about gifts that made sense to me as a child, a very young child, that made less and less sense to me, that became less and less practical as I got older. Gifts that in some cases became liabilities. I was a real sensitive kid. You can't be on a street corner and be sensitive. It just doesn't work. And so there's been a lot of, you use the word repair. And there's been a lot of emotional and spiritual repair that I've been on a journey of for many years, but has grown in a very specific kind of intensity in relationship to being able to be of use to these folks who just want to embody their calling to create a new care system because they pursued it because they knew they had a gift to care for others. and the system prevents it from using it in ways that it ought to be used. And so your point about interconnection, Nwamaka, resonates, in my heart, because I see how my own need to transform myself plays a role in facilitating conditions that allow others to share their gifts. And that if we don't connect to, claim, and do the necessary work to repair ourselves to be able to share those gifts, conversely, if we do that work to repair ourselves, to connect to those gifts, we have the possibility to take this moment of crisis and transform it into something that I imagine could be very, very beautiful, dignity affirming, and sustainable, and regenerative even. Yeah.
That just felt like a prayer. I feel like I just want to say ashe to all of that. And yeah, I look forward to hearing kind of the stories and learnings that come out of this process, because I think this is the hope, right? That we all could start to see ourselves as, and I appreciate you framing it as right-sized, because I think oftentimes we're so used to seeing the big charismatic leader. I think you and Amaka had talked about this last week around, like, there's some people really respond to one big leader outside of ourselves as the person to like go and find a solution and do the thing. And the invitation for us to actually sit still in our homes and look within ourselves.
Yeah.
As the people that may be able to come forth and do something. And so I think that's once again where the individual transformation can be so powerful in this moment. And so, yeah, and I think what's also really special about what you just lifted up is talking about spirituality. Like, I'm not trained in any particular spiritual practice. I grew up in the church, in an organized religion, but that's not currently where I'm at. But there is a spiritual awakening, a sense of interconnectedness that feels that is a calling that sometimes can be hard to kind of put a hard rubric or name on. But I hope that people can use this moment to sit still and kind of figure out, what is that calling? What are we spiritually being called to do? And how may we explore taking a leap within ourselves to try something and do it? And so, yeah, I really look forward to kind of watching the journey of this work. And one of the things that came up for me as well as you were talking was, I think oftentimes when I talk about my work and around the place-based projects that I support, similar to the care system you guys are developing, people are like, well, do you not see your role for government? And I feel it's always important to clarify that I do think that there is a role for government. I think what this COVID-19 rapid response is visibilizing is that oftentimes we've kind of looked to a federalist centralized government as the place to kind of organize centralized activity that needs to happen across the federated states. And what we're seeing right now is a vacuum of intelligent leadership in terms of what does it look like to kind of lead and bring together all these different states to kind of act once again in a collective will and a collective good. And so I think I'm continuing to just kind of wrestle with, like, what is the role of government? We know that our government is really good at war and at weapons. And what we've seen is that our government is very poor at supporting the things that are conducive to dignified care, like you've lifted up, right? We can stockpile weapons, we can stockpile artillery, but we won't stockpile personal protective equipment. We actually don't advise our nonprofit hospitals to not maintain empty hospital beds, even though those are the things that we know are conducive to taking care of those of us that are kind of within the United States. And so I think I'm just kind of sitting with this, right? Like, well, what is the role of government if we're if it is unable to kind of take care of the people that live within kind of these fictitious borders that we drew up. It seems like we're really good at everything outside of the borders and everything good when it comes to war and violence, but within it, we lose the care for that. It's almost as if I was to go back to this metaphor of uh, economy meaning the management of home, like I'm out there doing everything outside the world, but then I come home and I fail to kind of take care of those that I share space with, that I care for in my home, and the maintenance of it just doesn't quite make sense. And so, but all that to say, I mean, I do think that there is a place where the public sector, the ability to kind of provide roads and services, there are some things that we all just collectively need. And so I'm curious to kind of see what people's assessment is around the role of government, the how we think about our elected leaders in this moment coming out of COVID, kind of seeing the failure of that leadership and how people may choose to act differently. You know, as we approach the 2020 elections, and once again, this is someone who comes out of an electoral organizing background. I was a Democratic delegate back in the day at one point in Sacramento. And, you know, I question whether the Democratic Party will actually show up and provide the leadership that we need, even if the person that we're left with as the presumptive candidate wins, right? Will they actually start to change our healthcare system? I think Biden's been really vocal in saying that he's not for healthcare for all, right? We have yet to see the Democratic Party put out any type of immigration plan to protect those that are abused at the borders. We have yet to see the Democrats put out an articulation around how they may change the 2017 tax reform bill that was passed. So all this to say, I think we need to continue to engage in politics and engage in governance. And we need to still be able to raise the questions that are really critical towards figuring out how we improve those institutions and improve those systems. And we can't just put blind hope and faith into any one thing, but that know that we need to be able to stretch ourselves and our capacities to both kind of engage in our local care systems like you're setting up, while still filling out our census form, while still kind of participating in our local politics as well. And so how do we cultivate the capacity to kind of engage in all the different realms of society that we know are conducive towards overall a more equitable and healthy society? Yeah.
I love that question. And I want to give folks an opportunity. I want to ask folks to, if they have questions, please put them in the comments. I'd like to share a couple thoughts around the question you just raised, if that's okay, and then we'll check those questions. I love your emphasis on not putting eggs in one basket, if you will, not just focusing on one thing. I want to be plain too that I have no doubt that the Democrats will not show up in a way that is useful, and that just is what it is. But what I hear, this relationship of these small projects to electoral politics, is the language that I find helpful in raising that question. I think about, if we understand political power as power over, like a kind of ability to enact force. And I think about people who are working to create a localized care system or cooperatively owned buildings, you know, as you were talking about. I think of that as people exercising a kind of power from within. And I like to pose the question of, how do we understand the relationship of power from within to power over? And I find that helpful because let me back up. A handful of years ago, we were still living in Brooklyn, and Newark, New Jersey, right across the river. Ras Baraka was elected mayor. you know, and I don't know Ross, but I've been in organizations with people who were in his cabinet, and I know them, you know, and I have some understanding of Ross's politics and take the brother to be in good faith, you know, like unquestionably. And his administration began to explore privatizing the ports. And because I knew people or was familiar, had, you know, was in circles with people who were in his administration, I was able to say, you know, these are not opportunists. These are not people, these are people who know that privatizing the ports is not going to be a strategy over the long term that benefits Newark's poor Black residents. And that because I knew these folks and knew that this was something that they would have never thought was a good idea, something said there's something at play here that is below the surface. And it led me to raise the question: if you have political power at the municipal level and you're in a city that's poor and Black, like Newark or Baltimore or Detroit, or Camden, New Jersey, and a number of places, how do people develop access to income? And I began to wonder, and I said, you know, if you don't, and thank God, you know, my experience, particularly on the east side of Detroit, but Detroit in general, I had seen people like, you know, Feed and Freedom Growers, there's the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network. There's an organization called Insight Focus, which is a digital fabrication lab that is training, you know, young Black folks, and even returning citizens and young people in foster care to engage in digital fabrication and be able to produce without a need for a market. And I began to say, man, if politicians with, I put this in quotes, good politics, feel forced to explore options like privatization to provide for citizens, what if we began to develop small scale, local, place-based economic practices and therefore created the conditions for either somebody who comes from those projects or somebody who has a familiar enough relationship and integrity, you know, a relationship with integrity to say, you know, these people over here are doing something that makes sense, and engage policy that might protect those projects, that might make those projects, that might, you know, subsidize them in ways that corporations receive subsidies today. And so I think about this relationship between power over and power from within. For me, I see a potential to transform the very notion of elected political power, if we think about those two forms of power in relationship to each other, but being power over and power from within, or the creation of small scale local alternatives that have implications for our material survival and transform us culturally and personally.
No, I think I hope you write that down, or you do some type of, you know, think piece on it, because I think it's a beautiful way of integrating those two pieces, right? And as you were talking, there were a few examples that I started to think about in terms of like, well, where have I kind of seen this power from within and power over come together? And I think one of the places has been, you know, in California, when we moved to legalize cannabis, so much of the question was, well, where would we bank, right? So all these businesses connected to the cannabis industry, because of the federal government, can't use traditional banking institutions like the Wells Fargos and the Chases. And so the city of Oakland started to really reflect on, well, could these individuals actually these businesses come together to create a local public bank, so that rather than having to have all this cash on hand, right, that then puts them at victim for, maybe being targeted or whatever, rather than having all their income from their cannabis business with cash on hand, if we could create a local public bank, right? So those cannabis businesses bank with this public bank, and we know that banks are then those institutions
Sorry about that.
that help. No worries. That are then those financial institutions that help to create kind of loans back again within the community to support people that want to purchase homes or people that want to start businesses. And so starting to think about a public bank as a way for generating revenue to support a local economy, right? And that was actually legislation that went through the city of Oakland. And so I think North Dakota is one of the our only current public bank. But I think that's an interesting example of this power within and power over, right? People that have pushed to kind of legalize the industry, and then we start to see elected officials figure out, well, how can we be responsive to this need within the community? There's also this project that's been started by a local organization called the Sustainable Economies Law Center. And it's called the Next Egg Project. And it's a way to kind of rethink, rather than kind of investing in Wall Street for our retirement, could we start to create kind of a local market for people to kind of invest resources to support those values aligned small mom and pop businesses that, once again, provide a good living wage, have good labor practices, support the local community. And so an opportunity for me to think about putting some money to invest in, for instance, a Mandela Foods Cooperative, which is a local grocery store in West Oakland, a food desert, rather than investing in Amazon or Whole Foods on the stock market. And so there's mechanisms that people are starting to think through, like, yeah, this may be a way to also kind of support not only that local business, but when we think about essential workers, when we think about essential businesses, it's also a way of fortifying our essential local economy as a thing that we know kind of holds and anchors us in a moment of a global pandemic. And so I think that there's interesting examples like that. We also kind of see, people starting to advocate for cooperative laws to support cooperative businesses to ensure that they can also kind of get tax breaks. We start to kind of see laws shifting around the securities exchange law, so that what's called non-accredited investors, people who are not high net worth holders, can invest in businesses. Typically, there's up until this point, there's been laws that are based on the assumption that a person who is a high net worth holder, essentially a person who has $2 million in assets, in liquid assets, and or has an annual income of $250,000 or more, they've acquired that money and skill because they're smart enough, and therefore they're more knowledgeable about how to do investing. So anybody who falls below that threshold up until recently has not been able to invest in businesses for a share or for a dividend. And so being able to look at new mechanisms like a direct public offering, which was explored by Brahma Mahdi and his work with People's Community Market, also in West Oakland, around could a community resident kind of invest $10 to $100 a month, up to $1,000 total, in that local grocery store, as well as a way of helping that business kind of generate the income that they need to launch, but also being a cooperative member. And so we are starting to see the ways that kind of the economic experiments on the ground are starting to kind of, we start to see the political response meeting the community where they're already at or beyond, and starting to actually formalize them in a way that I think is worth noting. And I really do like this way of thinking about power within and power over. We should come back to that, but you should keep that one. That's a good one.
Thank you. Let's go to the questions. We got a lot of comments here. We got a lot of questions here. A lot of comments. Let's just start with this one right here. Oya Amakisi. I hope I didn't kill that name too badly. Asks, how do we heal the way we deal with acquiring resources as groups who are all working towards the goals of healthy liberation? The dynamics of capitalism, hierarchies, competition, lack of respect for generational contributions, etc., have negatively impacted our movements. How do we thrive and come together in this environment? I'm gonna read that once more. How do we deal with the way? How do we heal the way we deal with acquiring resources as groups who are all working towards the goals of healthy liberation? The dynamics of capitalism, hierarchies, competition, lack of respect for generational contributions, etc., have negatively impacted our movements. How do we thrive and come together in this environment?
Oh, that's a loaded one. Yeah, once again, I don't presume to have all the answers, but I have some reflections that I'm happy to offer up. And so I think one of the things that I always try to support the projects and groups that I engage with is, how do we start to think about disaggregating capital from capitalism? Because once again, for me, capitalism is a system. It's a system designed to kind of prop up profit maximization over the well-being of people and the planet. Capital is a tool, it's a resource, and capital can be used as a tool that can create harm, that can be really extractive and exploitative, or it can create healing. It can be really regenerative, and the ways that we exchange capital is the things that either create harm or create healing. And so I just think it's kind of important for us to figure out how we not be afraid of engaging in conversations around money, and as one piece, because we can start to challenge ourselves to do things differently. And I think the other piece is to everything that the name is Oya lifted up in their question is, we can't go around it. We have to actually go through it. And it's going through these experiments, it's going through being in deep relationship that's rooted in trust and accountability with people, that we start to not only get a sense of who we truly are as human beings and how we show up in the best and the hardest of times, but then what the projects are that sustain our community, what's actually necessary to support us in these moments. And I think the other rub to this question was, how do we do that in this moment, given COVID-19 and the sheltering in place? And I think I would invite people to kind of research and get involved with what are the mutual aid efforts in their local community. Because whether it's formal or informal, whether it's visible or underground, there are ways in which people are figuring out how to support their neighbors. I think one way that a friend shared with me, a dear friend, Jennifer Neer, out of New Hampshire, she talked about how her and her partner went door to door with their neighbors, with their gloves and masks on, left a note with their number, and was like, if you let us know if you need anything, if you are an elderly person who lives alone, we'll be happy to include groceries in our grocery run. So those are ways in which we get to start to experiment. What do we have the emotional and mental capacity for, and how are we able to show up for others? And it doesn't always have to be this big grand gesture, right? We get to start small, and not that small in terms of scale or less meaningful, but small in terms of the unit of relationship that starts to connect us with those that are closest around us. So I think that may be one way for us to kind of think about how we move through this moment.
I dig it. Thank you for that. That's a wonderful question. I will add on to that, and I think that one of the things that is really significant for me is, without being fools, believe that folks have the best intentions at hand. Because I think that one of the things that I've seen that's really, really helpful, and I learned this from Pam McMichael at the Highlander Center many, many years ago. And she would say that the first thing they do when they bring together a group of people from different backgrounds, racial, gender, sexual, regional, she says, we develop a set of common values because when the inevitable conflicts do emerge, it's very plain they are inevitable, there is the collective shares a set of values that they've agreed that they believe are important and want to work through. And in having those values, not only is a container made to be like, I'm willing to struggle with you because I know you share these same values I have. But hopefully, and in the best cases, those values can guide the process of struggling through conflict. And so they become a not just a container to hold people together, but a means of relating to each other within that container. And because I mean it's a huge question.
Could I share two pieces on that reflection? I think really quickly, I would lift up. So one of the projects that I have the pleasure of supporting is a project based off of the Restorative Economies framework. It's called the Restorative Economies Fund. It's a project of a new foundation called Katali. We don't yet have a web presence, but all this to say, we move financial and non-financial resources to support community-owned and governed projects on the ground. And one of the things I always ask people, in addition to like your due diligence on the building and da 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 da, where is your documented governance structure? Where is your documented joint venture agreement for how you resolve conflict? Because oftentimes people engage and they're so excited about these projects, but fail to actually go in understanding that conflict is just something that will emerge. Conflict doesn't have to be bad. But if we don't actually create systems ahead of time that are, once again, like you were saying, rooted in our values for how we resolve conflict, it's far too easy for us to kind of fall back on the dominant paradigm of infighting, of the project falling apart, of suing people. And so like being very intentional upfront about how we're governing or stewarding this resource together and how we will manage conflict when it arises is some of the keys for us to actually be successful in it.
Thanks for that, Nwamaka. We have another question here. I want to give a shout out to the brother Michael Scott representing Baltimore. Alan Frimpong is on here as well. I don't know where he lives anymore.
Hey, Alan.
There's a question here from the good brother Tyrone Thompson, representing the east side of Detroit. I believe East Warren in the house, but also Freedom Growers. And he has raised the question here. He says logistics. How do we connect the communities around the world and exchange resources and connections without relying on capitalism and corporations? And I'm gonna read that slower and again, because that strikes me as a question that I doubt either one of us has an answer to, but feels like a really important question. How do we connect the communities around the world and exchange resources and connections without relying on capitalism and corporations?
Yeah, this is a good question. I don't know if I have a response for it. I think one of the things I'm sitting with is, the reliance on Zoom, the reliance on Google Docs in this moment. And those are all big corporations that we're all kind of leaning towards to support that connectivity in this moment. I think that this is an opportunity for kind of decentralized networks. This is an opportunity to think about the role of community ownership and governance in tech, particularly as it pertains to kind of our own identities, our online identities, our information. I don't know. I think that's a really good question. I think we can work through the capitalism part, right? As we've kind of heard through Matt's example around sharing and time banking. And even though we can't physically be there with each other to kind of do time banking, I do think that there's ways for us to share information resource that isn't predicated on kind of profit maximization. I don't have a sense of who those large non-corporations are that are supporting information sharing and connectivity in this moment, but maybe others that are listening in can drop some suggestions in the chat box. But Matt, do you have a reflection on this question?
I don't know if I have a reflection. I want to big up Tyrone and the whole Feed 'em Freedom in Detroit. Y'all have made enormous contributions to my understanding of the world and what it looks like to build institutions. And I think that I think in a very, I don't have any big reflections. I mean, I think that I might look, if we weren't on a time constraint, I might look to a book like Eric Williams' book, Capitalism and Slavery. Um, Not because in it, I remember correct, if I remember correctly, he talks about how slavers built relationships with each other. Um, and as deplorable as that is, I think the question for me that Tyrone is raising is about, for me, there's an opportunity to ask the question of how do new things get connected in place and time when they're not in the same place. And for me, I reference slavery because the connections between the various West India companies, the building relationships between them was so critical for the slave system to build its strength that then allowed it to make such a deplorable, strong contribution to the emergence of patriarchal racial capitalism. And so for me, it's I think that I would raise the question of what where can we turn to historically to think about how those connections have been made previously, and where might we look in our personal lives to see how connections have been built that didn't necessarily make sense to make on the surface. And that's a process I go through whenever I think about how Grace Lee Boggs used to say, when a question comes up, I look at the history of the question. Mm-hmm. When have people raised it in previous periods? And I endorse that and add, when have I dealt with a similar question in my personal life? Mm-hmm. And might that be useful to understanding this larger question that I'm trying to figure out? I love the question. I don't pretend to have an answer.
That's super helpful, actually. I think Nwamaka had touched on this last week when she kind of lifted up this piece of if I can dream myself out of slavery, right? I can dream myself out of this moment. And so it does lead me to kind of think about the ways that enslaved people kind of shared the maps, shared the pathways through stories, through songs, through benchmarks along the journey with each other, or smoke signals that Indigenous communities use across distance and space. And so that it would actually be a really interesting and helpful study to kind of respond to this question. Yeah.
I dig it. Nwamaka, it is 4:57. Been profoundly generous with your time, your spirit, your thoughts, and I'm so very grateful to have been able to engage with you over the last 2 hours. It's been a thrilling conversation, if you will. And so I want to thank you, and I want to ask if there's anything you want to add before we part ways.
No, I just want to thank you for creating the space for me to kind of talk about my work, not specifically with one hat on, since I wear multiple, but just to show up as my whole self. So I really appreciate being seen in that way, and just the whole series that you've put together. Yeah, I would invite people. I'm not very good with the social medias, but I do have a Twitter account. I'm at Amaka Agbo, AMAKA AGBO. I'm also on Instagram. I'm terrible on there. My website is my full name, nwamakaagbo.com, and I'm a bit more responsive on email through my website. So hope that we get to continue the conversation, and I hope that you go away and do all the writings on all the things that you've learned over the series of the conversation. So yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nwamaka. I want to once again thank Nwamaka. I want to thank everybody here joining. I want to thank the folks who commented, who raised questions. If we didn't get to them, I'm sorry. If y'all have watched any of these before, you know I got technological skills to develop. I got growth to do in that area. So there might be questions embedded in there that I didn't get to, and charge it to my lack of technical proficiency, not my care. I want to invite everybody back. We'll be here next Saturday at 3 Eastern Standard Time, noon on the West Coast, where Martin Kirk will be engaging me in a kind of interview conversation format similar to Nwamaka and I have done this week around the theme of, it's called A Chance to Become More Fully Human, the decline of patriarchal racial capitalism and bridge building to a new historical civilization. And so we're back here for that. If you want more information on Visionary Organizing Lab, you can follow us or like us on Facebook. Twitter is visionary_lab. There's on our Facebook page, you can sign up for our email list, and you can always email info@visionaryorganizinglab.org for any more information. And I want to thank y'all for tuning in again. Once again, thank you, Nwamaka. It's been a beautiful conversation. I appreciate spending time with you. It's always a pleasure. So I hope to see folks next week. Thanks again, y'all. Peace.